Now, our next witness is Miss Cunningham, and I'm looking at a screen which does not have a video feed, but it may be that Miss Cunningham is able to hear me. Miss Cunningham, good afternoon. Are
Hi
you
there.
able to, first of all, hear me?
Yeah, I can hear yous and see yous.
Right. Thank you for that other piece of information, which was precisely what I was going to ask you. We now have you on screen. If during your evidence there's any, first of all, any technical problem at your end, no doubt you'll tell us, but our technical people, I suspect, will be on top of it. They'll know what's happening. The other thing is, if at any stage you want to take a break, just tell me and we can take a break. Now, I think you're happy about taking the oath?
Yep.
Could I ask you, just sitting where you are, raise your right hand, please, and repeat the words that I'm about to say. I swear by Almighty God
Swear by Almighty God,
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Miss Cunningham. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Duncan, who I think you've perhaps had the opportunity of meeting,
Yeah.
albeit not directly. Thank you, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, my lord. Hello again, Miss Cunningham.
Hey there.
We always start with some formal questions, and if you'll forgive me, I'll do the same with you. And so, can I just begin by having you confirm you are indeed Louise Cunningham, and you live with your
Yes.
2 sons in the west of Scotland, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And you've joined us today to talk about your daughter, Layla, who I think was born in July 2014, who passed away in January 2018, is that right?
That's
And is that a picture of Layla we're seeing behind you?
yeah, it's
You provided us a detailed statement and a detailed timeline, and are we right in understanding that you are content that that forms part of your evidence to the hospital inquiry?
yeah.
Thank you. And am I right in understanding that you've got a copy of it beside you?
Yeah, I've got it.
And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you perfect.
Okay, if we just begin, we're going to go through the story of Layla's treatment at the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow in 2017. But before we get to that, let's begin with diagnosis. And I think we can see from your statement that Layla hadn't been well for a spell, I think in March 2017, and you were backwards and forwards to the Royal Hospital for Children.
Yep, that's
Well,
correct.
to do so, Miss Cunningham, I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about that and maybe just take us up to the point where you get Layla's diagnosis.
Basically, they left took unwell towards the end of February, the start of March. And up to that time, we had one admission where we went in and we were discharged straight away, saying that she had a viral type infection. On the second occasion, I took her into the hospital, was admitted, and she was in the CDU unit for 2 days. And basically, we're still saying that at this point, a viral infection could last over 14 days. So again, we were discharged from the CDU, and I was then told that it was still a viral infection. The only thing they could see was Layla's hemoglobin was slightly low. So we came home, but nothing improved. She was just still lying about, very, very lifeless. She wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, was just like she looked like a ghost. She was so pilly wally. So I took her back up to the hospital on a third occasion, and again he says, "Oh, we think it's still a viral infection," but I refused to leave that time. I said, "No, I think there's something more going on," and they were kind of like making out that I was being an overprotective mother and it was a viral thing. And I said, "No," I said, "I want to see a different doctor." So at that point, they admitted us up toward 2C. and they done bloods and things. They kept saying they think it was still viral. And then later on, it was early hours of the morning of the 17th that a nurse and doctor had arrived into the room to say they had to take Leila for a CT scan and an X-ray to be done. And I'd kind of questioned why, and they just said, "Oh, we found something in her bloods." And I said, "What do you mean you found something? Like, why are we doing this at this time of night?" And I said, "Is this something serious?" And basically, the doctor had said, "In instinct of what we found in the bloods, it can be quite serious." So we went for the CT scan and obviously the X-ray, and then they'd come back into the room in the morning to say that Anne had showed that Leila had pockets of blood in her head. So they had said that Leila had any sort of like trauma to the head, and I said, "Well, bangs her head all the time." And it then says to me, "No, I mean, this would be trauma from a car crash." And I'd said, "Well, no, but you've got medical notes there, so you should be able to see." But they also found that our liver looked enlarged in the X-ray, but it turned out that she didn't really have any platelets in her body that was basically clotting the blood. So the blood was just floating about. There was no clotting anywhere, so that's why she had pockets of blood in her brain. On the morning of the 17th, we were taken straight down to ultrasound at 9 a.m. in the morning. Done the ultrasound, and basically at that point, went back to the wards. I kind of knew. I went up to 2C, and there was two doctors and two nurses asking me to step into the room across from where Leila was, and they basically told me that they found two masses within Leila's abdomen area, one in her liver and one in the gland above the kidney, on the left side. So basically, they said to me that they had to move me straight through toward 2A, which was just directly through from 2C. And I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Obviously, it's the oncology wards." But obviously, when you hear the word math, like, you know exactly what it is. But we get taken through there, and it was quite strange. It was as if Leila had basically deteriorated so much. It was as if she knew that there was obviously something wrong with her, and it's as if she knew that people knew, and she deteriorated quite quickly. Basically, it was a Friday, so they didn't want to start doing any tests over the weekend, so they basically just kept her comfortable. They ended up putting her onto a morphine pump. So it got to the stage where I wasn't even able to change the nappy without her being in pain. So she was put on fluids, transfusion, she was getting platelets. She also had to do like urine samples and stuff like that. So first thing on the Monday, basically took her away. She was away for 5.5 hours, and she got scans done. She got a DMSA scan, an MRI scan, she got lumbar punctures done, which basically they came back, and the doctor had basically says to me, like, the way Leila was acting and what they could see so far. Obviously they had to wait on biopsy results and the urine results. Neuroblastoma is a hard cancer to detect. It's most commonly you can find it in a DMSA scan and in a urine sample. Basically, the doctor came to me and Leila was getting worse, and he had basically said, "We won't have Leila's results," but his opinion of what he'd done all his life, he said that she thought she had stage 4 neuroblastoma cancer, and basically he, on his opinion, was he started treatment straight away because he didn't. Leila would have probably passed away while waiting on the biopsy results to come back.
Yeah, and I think we can see from your timeline, Miss Cunningham, that was about the 23rd of March. I think
Yeah, that's
that
correct.
the consultant was saying his suspicion was this is high risk neuroblastoma,
Yeah,
stage 4. We need to start chemo immediately. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And I think the diagnosis was in fact confirmed on the 27th.
It was confirmed that she had, confirmed that she did have stage 4 neuroblastoma cancer.
And I think Leila was 2 years and 8 months at this point. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, what I'm going to do in a minute is have you take us through Layla's treatment on Ward 2A and some of the key events. Before I do that, I want to ask you a little bit about Ward 2A. Now, we've had quite a lot of evidence about Ward 2A, so I don't need to go into it in too much detail, but you do mention a couple of things that I would be interested in hearing you tell us something about. Now, one of the things that you mention in your statement is the parents' kitchen, and you indicate that you found that quite a useful place for you to go. Can you maybe tell us a bit about that?
Basically, when Layla had went to the first day she'd went to for her scans and stuff like that, basically I was told her to leave the hospital because she'd be away for a while. But the parent kitchen was really good because you would walk along and you would meet families that you didn't know, and obviously kids weren't really allowed in the kitchen, so it was a good place to go if you needed to let off a wee bit of steam without your child seeing you being upset. And there was other parents there that you could speak to, and they were obviously in the same situation as us. Obviously, some days I would walk in, it would be a new family that was here, and like I was going through things. But obviously, when I first arrived in the ward, there was one particular man I met who basically spoke me through what was going to happen in the ward and stuff like that. And it was a useful place to go because you could go there and you could sit, you could cry, you could tea, you could have just basically your own headspace away from the room that you were actually in within the ward.
And you tell us a bit about this man, I think, in your statement. A man who was or who had been a minister, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. His daughter was within the ward as well.
And I think you also say to us that this was somewhere you could just go and sit and have a cup of tea or a cup of hot chocolate and just unload with
Just
somebody
basically
else.
unload, yeah. Even if it was one of the ones, if there was a family within the room, you could speak to them because obviously we were all in the same situation and we all wanted to offload, but we didn't want to put it on our own families. So offloading to each other helped because obviously you didn't want your family to see like how upset you were getting and what predicament you were in. You especially didn't want your child to see it. So being able to go a room where there's other parents there to offload, they're in the same situation, was a lot easier.
Now, another thing that you mention in relation to Ward 2A, and I think this is probably something that was more to do with Layla, there was a bath on the ward. And is that something that Layla particularly liked?
Yeah, because it was, it was, she used to call it her boat. It was like a huge bath. And it could, there was buttons on it so that it could raise up off the ground and go down, and it was really big. So Layla used to say, she wouldn't even say, "Can I go for a bath?" She'd say, "Can I go for my boat before my bed?" Because that's what she called it.
I think in your statement you say she was obsessed with the bath. Is
Yeah,
that
she was
right?
never out it. She was never out it. She'd have been in it all day if she was allowed.
Now, let's move on and have you take us through the timeline of Layla's treatment. And let's start at March. Now, what sort of treatment, what sort of chemotherapy treatment was Layla on?
Layla started with an 8 round of rapid Kojak chemotherapy, which was like 4 different types of chemo. They would last 3 or 4 days at a time. So she would had 8 rounds of that to start off with. And once we got the end of them, obviously it was making her quite unwell and things like that with sickness and stuff. But once we obviously finished our 8 rounds of our rapid Kojak chemotherapy, we done our scans to see that basically it had shrunk a tumour, but not enough to go in and operate. So we had to add in 2 rounds of TDD chemotherapy.
I'll come on to that. If we just stay in March at the minute, she had something called, did you say rapid Kojak?
Yeah, rapid Kojak chemotherapy.
COJEC, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And how was that administered to her?
It was through a Hickman line.
Now, something that we'll come on to later is that you indicate that Layla had a number of issues with her line throughout her care.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
are we right in understanding that, in fact, even right at the start, she experienced an issue with her line? Is that right?
Yeah, we basically got our Hickman line was administered for her to start our first round of chemotherapy. Basically, Layla was still very unwell, which the doctor was a bit confused about because usually when they get chemotherapy into them, it should pick them straight up. But Layla was still lying about quite lifeless, not what to eat, not what to drink. And then it turned out that found that she had an infection within her line. Before we were able to even move on to second round of chemotherapy, Layla had to go for a second surgery to get the line removed. Then we had to wait 48 hours for them to administer another Hickman line in, which basically went through the neck and down into the main artery of the body.
Yeah. Now, if we then move into April, do you recall that there was a point in April where the ward was effectively shut down or locked down?
Yeah, we were basically put on lockdown. No one was allowed out. We weren't allowed to leave the ward. We weren't allowed to leave our rooms. We weren't allowed to go to the parent kitchen because of something called the rhinovirus. Obviously, I'd never heard of it, but the ward was put straight on lockdown. We weren't allowed out of rooms. We weren't allowed anywhere. Nobody was allowed to attend the ward. So that was us isolated in a room. We couldn't communicate with other families. We couldn't see our own families. I wasn't allowed to see my other children. And this went on for about 2 to 3 weeks, I recall.
Now, I've got a couple of questions about that. Was it you who was with Layla on the ward?
Yeah, I was there the whole 10 months. I never left. I was there every single day and night that Layla was in the ward.
And the other question I was going to ask is, why is it you are able to pinpoint this to April? Why is it you're able to recall this event in particular?
Just because our family had come over from Ireland, our auntie had come over and basically they were coming to, like, they hadn't actually met Layla because, and they were coming over to meet her, and basically when they had arrived over from Ireland, the ward had been shut, and basically we had signs outside saying there was no entry, nobody was allowed in, nobody was allowed out. So Layla never got to meet her family at that point in time because it was shut down. So they travelled from Ireland at that point. So that's how I know it was pinpointed in April.
Thank you. And what was the effect on Layla at this stage about the two of you effectively being locked into the ward for this period?
It just wasn't right because she was used to being able to, for me to take her a walk in her pram up and down the ward or carry her wheel with her grip stand. Like, she was able to go outside her room, and too much for her. She still was pretty unwell at this point in time. But from a 2-year-old's point of view, I've been made to stay behind the door without being able to step foot out. Even opening the door, the nurses were ushering you back into the room. So, like, confining a 2-year-old to one room is extremely hard. It's really, really harsh because I didn't understand why she wasn't allowed to see her gran or her brothers or anything like that. So she would be asking for them, and I'm having to say, oh, there's just there's a wee bug in the hospital, we need to stay in the room. But a 2-year-old, she had no recollection. She didn't know or understand what was going on. But obviously, the effect on myself at that point was quite stressing because I wasn't able to take 5 minutes to get myself out of the room to just to get a cup of tea, or for my mum to sit with her for 10 minutes for me to go downstairs to go and get something to eat or whatever. So it was quite hard. Like, you were having to buzz constantly for somebody to say, you do this for me or can you do that for me. From the parent room, we weren't allowed out, so but you felt as though you couldn't buzz because there was other people on the board who were extremely unwell, and you didn't want to take the effect away from the kids that really needed it by buzzing for the nurses all the time.
So you and Layla literally stuck in a room for, what did you say, 2 to 3 weeks?
2 to 3 weeks it was, yes.
And The only people coming into the room would be,
nurses and the doctors, yes.
and Layla would have no access to the playroom or anything like that, is that right?
No access to the playroom. There was no access even beyond their door. Even if you opened the door, you were kind of getting in trouble. Like, you need to keep the door closed at all times.
And you would have no access to the parents' kitchen and therefore no opportunity to
No,
make food for her.
no, no. Layla was quite a fuss eater. So see, when you were getting given the same food every night, it got to the stage where she wasn't wanting to eat because it was just the same scenario. She wasn't getting a different option. Whereas when I had use of the parent kitchen, myself and a few of the families that I'm quite close with, we would go to like Asda or whatever and get stuff in that we knew that she would eat because the food scenario, it was the same food day in, day out, so they were getting fed up of it.
And something that you've mentioned is also about her not being able to see other family members. Was that an issue for her?
It was because she wasn't getting, she was very close with her gran and her brothers and her auntie and things like that. So the fact that her cousins and her brothers and her aunties and her gran and her dad and that weren't allowed in to the ward, she was finding it hard. And when we were coming off a video call, he was getting upset, and then I'm trying to prevent myself from getting upset when I'm trying to explain everything that's going on, because the last thing you want to do is for your child to see you sitting in a room crying and upset, because it's not fair for them to see that.
And again, just thinking about these early weeks in Layla's treatment, did you notice anything else happening as regards the rooms?
Basically, when we were in there was a lot of deep cleaning that started to be done within the ward. Started moving the rooms to clean them, and every other day we had infection control that was in the ward. And basically, when I was admitted to the ward on 17th of March, we were told to basically make the room our own. So I brought Layla's quilt and our pillows from home. I brought her teddy. She had like a few of her toys and stuff that she wanted. Obviously, she was getting balloons and cards and stuff like that. And then it got to the stage where infection control were never out of the room. Your room was getting cleaned 2 to 3 times a day. We were then told that everything we had within the room was to be sent home. We weren't to keep anything within the room, which after them letting the kids get comfortable within a room and having their own stuff, have to send that away and then not have anything and be made to keep one or two things was quite hard on them. We had any drawings that had been done, any paintings, everything sent away. We weren't allowed anything. She was allowed to keep like a couple of teddies and that was it. Whereas before she had a wee pramming doll that she would go up and down the ward with. Everything had to go. And at that point, the cleaning team in the ward started bringing in like plastic drawers sets, and one in the bathroom and one within the room, and said that everything was to lie on the floor. We weren't allowed any of our toiletries sitting about the bathrooms. Everything had to be away. And then that's when they started moving us from room to room. And you would see the rooms getting like deep cleaned. They would put plastic coverings over the door so when the room was completely closed all the time, and we were doing like deep cleans. I think Layla was in every room in that ward with being admitted and being moved to the rooms being deep cleaned.
And when you say infection control or infection prevention control, are you meaning cleaners? Are you meaning doctors? Are you meaning
No,
both?
actual infection control. Like at one point, the sister of the ward, like the head nurse at the time, she had come in and said, "Oh, infection control want you to send everything away," and I was like, "Send everything away," and she went, "Can't have all this in within the room," and I was like, "Well, it's just what we were told to do, make the room as comfortable for Layla as possible," and she's like, "No, no, infection control, want everything away," and they were on the ward every day, check your rooms every day, and if there was anything lying about, like even like my mum was doing like washing, obviously I stayed close enough to the hospital that I didn't need to go to the click house, so my mum was doing like my washing things, so she was bringing it back up like in a case and stuff. You weren't even allowed a case to be lying on the floor. You weren't allowed nothing lying about that room at all. And if you did, the infection control would basically be on at you every other day.
And did you yourself see the infection control personnel?
Yeah, seen them numerous days. They were in the ward every day. They would walk by your room. They would look in your room. They were there every day. They were on the ward.
And did they appear to be cleaning staff or medical staff or something
No,
else?
they must have been. They weren't cleaning staff. Cleaning staff, you'd the same cleaners every day. You'd your cleaners through the week. You'd the cleaners at the weekend. But they were in with their suits and stuff, so you knew they weren't just there as being a cleaner. They were there, and they were walking about with a clipboard and notes every other day.
And you indicated that effectively Layla had to give up some of her belongings, is that right?
Yeah, she had to basically send everything we had in the ward away, like any pictures or balloons that people brought her up, like well cards, everything had to go. She was allowed to keep one doll and two teddies, and they had to sit on her bed. Everything that she had in the room was taken away.
I mean, up until that point, just thinking about what you've just said, had you done everything you possibly could to make her room feel like
Yep,
her own room at home?
Yeah, basically we were told this is Layla's obviously treatment was going to be a foreseeable treatment. So we initially went into the ward. We knew we were going to be in there to at least June, so that would be 3.5 months. So we were there the whole time, and Layla had her stuff there. She had like a wee pram in her doll. She had her toys that she liked. She had her teddies on her bed, and basically we're told everything had to go. And Layla at that point started getting upset because when they were doing deep cleans, you found quite often that the room that like the playroom would be closed because we're doing cleaning, so never really had stuff in a room. Like the play team were good, they would bring like the arts and crafts into the room for them to do, but not the same as being able to go to a playroom and be amongst other children and be able to have fun, because when the infection control came on the ward, it was just a total different thing. And it didn't feel like a happy place where you're meant to make your kids feel comfortable. It felt more like a stricken area, which in a children's ward it shouldn't be.
Yeah. So for those who want references in the statement, it's paragraphs 27 and 28 and 75. I'm not going to ask you to turn those up just now, Ms Cunningham. But if we imagine the room before infection control arrive, are we to picture something that had balloons up, had cards, had toys, a pram with a dolly in it? Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, and she had her teddies all along her bed, her favourite teddies she had. There was her pictures up on the wall that she'd painted and things like that. They were all round. So the room was basically it was basically like her own wee room, because she had all her toys and her teddies that she loved.
Yeah. I mean, if you had to put a percentage on how much of that stuff had to go, what would it be?
About 98%. Basically, she was left with a doll in her bed and a few teddies. Every bit of paper, card, balloon, everything had to go out. Our colouring books had to go because the infection within the ward just said all of the stuff could have been contaminated. So I had to get someone to come and collect it and take it all the way home.
How much of it was allowed to come back eventually?
Basically, you never really got to bring much of it back at all. If anything came into the ward, it had to be brand new, basically, like in within a box. It hadn't been used at home or anything like that. That it's like they didn't want you to. Basically, we weren't allowed any clutter within a room whatsoever.
At any point before Layla's inpatient care concluded, did her room go back to the way it had been before?
Only time that Layla had a few stuff in her room was through transplant, because we were isolated to the one room, and basically it was the Jonah Byrne Foundation who had got Layla lots of new dolls and repaint and colouring things and like that, but that all had to be brought in brand new within the box. If anything had been opened, it wasn't in. And then the minute we moved out of transplant and we get moved back into a normal room, we need to go again.
Was there ever any explanation for what had happened in Layla's room?
No, we'd ask on a few occasions, like, why do we keep getting moved rooms? And we're told that other people needed the room, but then when you were seeing that rooms were being closed and getting cleaned out, like it was industrial clean, but it wasn't like day cleaning stuff, wasn't normal cleaning products. It was like strong smelling. So I think we were in nearly every room within the ward at some point, apart from the teenage unit.
Yeah. Now, after this, again, still thinking about these early weeks, March, April, after that, did isolation become quite a regular feature of Layla's care?
Yeah, it did. Isolation, like obviously when they were on, I had to actually have a debate with my consultant to speak to infection control, because Layla also, like through her treatment, she'd be quite sick and have a lot of an upset belly, but it was only when she was on treatment or on antibiotics. And basically any time you had slightest bit of diarrhea, you were in isolation, your room was locked down, you had to be 48 hours clear. I had to kind of fight with infection control and say to my consultant that I wasn't happy, because I was only being locked into lockdown because of the treatment and because of the medication that they were prescribing her. It was all side effects, so we were isolated constantly because through the treatment plan, that's what the side effects are. So the fact that they knew this and they still isolated us, knowing it wasn't an infection our kids had, it was just part of treatment. But for them, it was easier just to isolate us to a room.
Did they say whether it was because they were concerned that Layla's diarrhea might pose a risk to others on the ward? Is that it?
Basically, they says it could have been an infection and it could be passed on and stuff. But until she started her chemo or started an antibiotic or certain medications which were on her own, and over time we've seen a pattern, and infection control were constantly putting you in lockdown. The ward would say, oh, it's not us, it's infection control. And basically I ended up having to say to my consultant, I'm not happy with this, because we were never out of a room. We were locked in a room constantly, or you would get out for a day and then they would give her an antibiotic or give her chemo, and that would be it away again. And that's you locked to a room again.
And when you say out for a day, at this stage, out for a day would mean just out into the rest of
Just
the ward?
up and down the wards, or being able to put her in her pram and like take her over to the other building. Just for a walk, I wasn't allowed off the hospital grounds because Layla's treatment was quite intense in the first few months, so we weren't allowed to leave the hospital. We were always within the hospital, so she was used to getting up in the morning and we'd go over to the canteen and we would get like a wee roll and sausage or whatever, because it was in the morning, it was toast or cereal every day, and obviously when you're at home you've got a selection of food. So when we were able to take her for walks and stuff like that and get her rolls and things like that, it made her broke up her day a wee bit from being stuck within this ward.
And where else, when you're describing being able to go, to leave the room on those occasions and go elsewhere, was that still just within the children's hospital?
No, we were allowed to go through the tunnel which took us into the adult hospital so we could go to the canteen, because in the children's hospital there wasn't anything like shops and things were within the adult hospital. Only thing that was in our hospital was coffee shop, which is obviously that's no good to a 2-year-old child. Whereas if we went over to the adult building, the canteen, we'd Marks and Spencer's, we'd W.H. Smith's, we'd the soup bar. So we were able to give her more of a choice to pick stuff that she actually wanted instead of stuff that was given to her on a daily basis, because that's all we were getting served in the wards.
How often was it that she was allowed out into the ward and out into the rest of the hospital?
Very rarely in the first few months, because we were in isolation most of the time, because our treatment was giving her sickness and diarrhea, and basically as soon as you have that, you're isolated. It's infection control, isolate you straight away.
And do we understand from your evidence, it's paragraph 32 for those who want the reference, that there would be times when you would see a sign or some tape go up on the door. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. We would always have a sign on the door, this room's in isolation, do not enter unless you are basically we're prepped with like aprons and gloves and stuff like that, because like the side effects of treatment is a normal thing. You would think that they were already set up, like they should know that's part of treatment, but they were having to come in with gloves and aprons and stuff like that. Obviously they were going to other rooms with other children, but it's we were always getting signs put in the door, and like some days you wouldn't even know you were in isolation. You'd wake up in the morning, you would open your blind, and there would be a sign in the door, and Layla would upset and go, "Mummy, I've got a sign. That means I can't go out." Like she knew when that yellow sign was on the door that she was in that room. She wasn't allowed out it, and like for a child to understand that, it's not a very nice thing.
Yeah. And she turned 3, I think, in, over the summer 2017. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that would be during the period that all of this was going on. Is that right?
Yep.
And what was the effect on Layla when you think about those months of predominantly being locked down into your room?
It was just you seen her kind of deflated. Her wee happy self wasn't there because she wasn't allowed to go and stay with MD. She wasn't allowed to mix with MD. Like it wasn't a wee child to be living. It was not fair. Like we were towards the end, we started getting like a few hours at home, and to the stage where we got home, she didn't want to go back to the hospital. She was allowed to play with her brothers and see her dogs and stuff like that. So going back in there and going straight into an isolation room, like she didn't like it at all.
I think you say at paragraph 35 of your statement, Ms. Cunningham, you say the hospital was her life. She didn't know about running about with kids. She didn't know her ABCs. She knew nothing other than the hospital. Is that right?
Like she could tell you names. She could tell you when she needed certain medication. Like just turning 3, she could tell you that I'd say, "Do you want me to buzz for paracetamol?" And she'd go, "No, mummy, I'm really sore." Like she could tell you when she needed morphine, tell you when she needed her cyclozine, like her anti-sickness. She didn't know what her ABCs or her colours or stuff, but she could tell you their treatment, like what she needed. She knew when she needed anti-sickness. She knew when she was itchy for like ferritin. She knew when she needed like pain relief. She could tell me what she needed, and she didn't know normal children stuff, but she knew medical term stuff.
Now, I think we can see, if we just move through the timeline a bit then, Ms. Cunningham, I think we can see from that round about August, September 2017, I think Layla had completed her rounds of Kojak by that time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
And
correct.
I think, as you've just indicated, mainly she was in the hospital for all of that. Mainly she was in her room for all of that. But I think, did you indicate that there was some time where she got out the hospital for a few hours? Is that right?
We were allowed to come home for a couple of hours. We would get to come home, we'd leave like in the morning, we would just need to check her bloods, waiting her results to come back to make sure obviously she wasn't neutropenic. And we would get to come home for a few hours throughout the day. But obviously we had to be back in for certain times and stuff like that, for like medications and stuff. So she started getting to come home and a bit of fun, but it was only in a small period of time, because once she was rescanned at that time, we seen that the tumour hadn't shrunk enough for surgery, which took us back into the ward. We were put down to TDD chemotherapy, and basically that was the highest chemotherapy. It just broke her body down, like completely destroyed anything she had, because it was that strong that we ended up in a ward in a room where she was in that much pain. She was that neutropenic that they had her on a morphine pump, and Layla had a high pain threshold. So basically, the pain team had said to the nurses, when you go in with Layla with morphine, you need to start higher and work your way down. They started off slow. This was a weekend, and there wasn't any. Through the weekend, you didn't have any of your pain team on. It was just like an anaesthetic doctor, and basically started her off, and I kept saying to them, like, that's not strong enough. I was having to push the button for the extra morphine, and they were said to me, oh, it's too much, and they added in ketamine to her pain relief at this point. And Layla was basically awake for about 32 hours. She was hallucinating, she was panicking, she was seeing people in the room that weren't there, and it was all because ketamine. She took a bad reaction to the ketamine. Like, she had a fan in the room because she had a temperature, so her pillow, she kept feeling as though her pillow was really warm, and I'm having to put her pillow over at the fan and then give it back, and it was like every few minutes she wanted it hand down to put back on her. But, like, she was seeing my mum in the room, she was seeing her brothers in the room, and then shouting for them, and it wasn't. It was just the ketamine had started her hallucinating really bad, and she was awake for like 32 hours solid. As soon as the pain team came in the Monday morning, like, they were really angry. Like, they should have never have went in with the ketamine. If they'd looked at her records properly, they've seen that the pain team see that she needs to start in higher dose of morphine and get released down, but they never. They just brought in ketamine, and it just really didn't agree with her. She was just in a terrible state. It was horrifying to actually watch it.
I think by this stage, in September, Layla was ready to go to surgery. Is that right? But
Yeah, that's
uh,
correct.
you were given a bit of a wee break before that. Is that right?
Yeah, we got given basically before she went for her surgery, they had to take her stem cells. So done that, and we got a wee break to Craigtara. So we went there, but we were meant to be there for like 5 days. But after 3 days, they'd phoned and said that they didn't have enough stem cells for Layla's transplant, because obviously Layla got the stem cells back. Basically, her stem cells, it wasn't a stem cell donor. Her stem cells were basically pumped through the machine. They were cleaned and given back into her. So we had to come back from the holiday after 3 days, back to the ward, do that, and then basically we were moved up to ward in 3A, which was basically where Layla went to go for her surgery.
Did you say 3C there?
3A.
Yes. And how was Layla after her surgery?
Her surgery itself was quite a long procedure. She was in surgery for 10.5 hours. So, being away from the hospital, and basically they said they were going to give us an update, and I didn't get an update until like near enough 8 o'clock at night. They'd phoned to say that surgery was at success. They'd removed 90 to 95% of her tumour. And that was just like basically for closing up her abdomen for myself to make her dad to make her way up to the high dependency unit, like intensive care unit. And we got there, so Layla was basically had a full like sad face right round her whole belly, like there was a right round. So we were kept in high dependency for. We were quite lucky. Layla was due to basically she should have been in like an induced sleep for like 40 hours, but she woke straight up and asked for iron brew and nippy crisps. So the team and the surgical team were kind of quite shocked. So basically, obviously, she still had an epidural in her back. She was lots of wires within everywhere, so we had to go to the ICU. But Layla was quite lucky that after the next day, she seemed to be all right. That take some of her stuff away, and after on the second day, we were checked her kidneys and her bladder to make sure everything was in working order, and we were then moved back up to the ward. So Layla kind of bounced back from everything she went through. She bounced back really quick. So within like 10 days, we were back home after our surgery, which shocked the nurses and doctors because they were quite shocked. Like, kids don't usually bounce back as quick, and Layla was up and walking about in the third day and wanting to go to the playroom and things like that.
And are you indicating that over that spell, prior to her bouncing back, she did go into the paediatric intensive care unit? Is that right?
Yeah, Layla was taken straight. She was taken straight there from theatre. So basically, that's where I had to go and meet her. But obviously, I hadn't. Obviously, when you're in there, you're not meant to be allowed to stay there with your child overnight. You're like sit there, but if you've got to start, you're meant to leave. But as I say, Layla was that attached to me. She wouldn't really stay with anyone else. So even if I got up, go to the sink or the bin or the toilet, jumping up, like trying to pull herself up, and it got to the stage where the nurses said, listen, we're not meant to do this, but Layla's going to be more at a risk of bursting her stitches or hurting herself if I wasn't beside her. So they brought me in a recliner chair and gave me a cover just to kind of be the side of Layla's bed, because Layla wouldn't go with anyone else. She was attached to me. She was born, so me not being in her sight was going to cause her more distress, and the nurses asked me to stay with her. She didn't get upset or pull any of her wires out or anything.
And it was after that that she bounced back. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we moved back up to the ward the second day. Obviously, she still had her catheter in, she still had her epidural and stuff like that. And but when we were on the ward, they started, and the third day they took the catheter out, the epidural out. They did still have her on a morphine pump at that point, just to try and keep on top of the pain. But like, she was up and she was standing, she was taking short walks. Where her room wasn't too far from the playroom, so it was managing a wee 10-15 minutes out of bed and going to the playroom, and then she would get a bit tired and go back. But she just bounced back from it. Like, it was just like, I was in shock. The doctors and nurses were in shock that we're home within 10 days. Just took it in her stride. So she did.
Now, can you walk us through the next stage? I think that stem cell surgery.
That was a stem cell transplant. So basically, that was in September. So my birthday was the 19th of September, and we were within the ward. And that day, basically, they gave Layla the highest dose of chemotherapy that she could get, which basically broke her body down to nothing. Like, she had to have no goodness within her body, joy. So they done that. The next day we were moved through to the first room as you came into the ward, one of the transplant rooms. We were within there. That's where transplant, like stem cell transplant, was carried out. That was one of the harder parts of treatment, because you're not allowed visitors. You're very rarely allowed out the room. Like, nobody can come in the room. If they come in, it's double doored. So basically, when I was coming in, I would have to outdoor shoes and stuff to go into the room with her. But that was one of the harder parts of treatments, because there was days where she was lying in the bed and without it, but her nose was just constantly pouring blood. So she was constant ice packs and platelets running constantly. Like, that was one of the hard parts. She was breaking out in rashes, but head to toe, big red blotches all over her. Like, that's one of the worst parts of treatment that I did see her go through. It was horrific to have to be stuck in a room and watch with no one basically help you, or go out the room to the parent room and have a cry, because you had to try and keep yourself away from any sort of bacteria, infection, anything. So you weren't really allowed anywhere. You were only allowed like one person, like myself and our dad in the room. They did make a certain. They did allow my mum to be a third person. I wasn't within the room. My mum was allowed in, but that was only so I was allowed out to see the boys. Obviously, I wasn't able to see them. And the transplant was quite a long period, so not being able to see your other two children was quite hard. So they did make an exception that my mum could sit within the room, but basically I was only allowed outside with the kids for not long, and then I had to come back in another room. I'd need to take my outdoor clothes off, change into different clothes before coming back into the transplant room.
Yeah, and you set all of that out at paragraphs 47 and 48 of your statement, and I think really in some summarise, I think what you're saying is that Layla was severely unwell after this process, and she was even more isolated than she had been before. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
But are we right in understanding that the stem cell transplant was a success and she was discharged in October?
Yeah, well, basically, yeah, they said stem cells had been a success. We were told that there was no certainty that some of the cells might not have been cleaned and stuff like properly because she got her own stem cells back, but obviously neuroblastoma could have went back into her because not every stem cell could have been properly cleaned before going back into her. It was basically and we were discharged in October, and then we went back in on the November for scans, and basically at that point we seen that the neuroblastoma had reoccurred.
Yeah, now I'll come on to that in a minute. So she's discharged in October, and I think implicit in what you've just said is she goes on to outpatient care at that point. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, I want to look at events in November. I'm going to ask you about two things. You've already mentioned one of them, which is the recurrence of the neuroblastoma. That's the second thing I'm going to ask you about. The first thing I'm going to ask you about is an infection. Are we right in understanding that on about 22nd of November, you had to take Layla to the hospital with a fever?
Yeah, basically we get to the stage where, like, obviously a normal fever for a child's 37.5 would give Calpol, but we're not allowed to do that. As soon as we reach 38, our kids are admitted straight to the ward for antibiotics, and basically they used the central line, and then they put antibiotics in, and then they flushed it through with fluids. So we left the wee room we were in, went out to the bit, and just after very, very fast, like, they were just, you're kind of like shaking, and I was like, there, and I'd says to the nurse, like, this shaking, like she's not looking at herself, and she was like quite jerky. So the nurse said, let's go back in the room. We went into the room, and it just got worse and worse, and checked the temperature, and it showed that temperature wasn't like very high. They were trying to flush fluids through her, like pump, like they were flushing fluids through. They were trying ice cold fluids through her, and she went into what they called a triggered seizure. Did this for maybe about 45 minutes. After about 10 minutes of the nurses trying, they told me that they had to phone for the team, up, the crash team and stuff. They wanted up really, really quick because Layla seizure was getting quite out of hand. Her temperature kept rising. The seizure was getting worse. Well, basically, they had basically phoned them to come up. She said, listen, the room's going to get really, really full. Like, just hold the oxygen mask to Layla's face. Try and not look up. I had an oxygen mask at Layla's face. The alarms were going off. And at that point, the room became full of these doctors. And I remember I did look up at one point, and 10 doctors just went into veins and Layla basically with ice cold water because her temperature was that high that they didn't get her temperature down. It could have basically caused quite a bit of damage to Layla's brain. So with Eamon working on her, it took them about 45 minutes to stabilise Layla at that point.
And did they eventually get her stabilised?
We did manage to get her stabilised, the seizure stopped, and still had to keep the oxygen on. Once that team had basically finished, her doctor had come in to take her over and stuff. But at this point, she was totally exhausted. She was totally drained. But they said this happened. Temperature had come down a wee bit. So once we managed to stabilise her in Ward 2B, we were then admitted into Ward 2A, which was obviously the normal ward.
And are we right in understanding that about a week after that, she had her line removed?
Yeah, that's correct. Layla had her line removed because they found another infection again. But at this point, this was Layla's 8th line that she was having inserted.
So the new line would be her 8th line.
Yep.
And at this time, were you given any explanation for what had happened?
No, it just said that there was an infection. They tried to treat it with antibiotics. Basically, there was get the infection out the line, and if the antibiotics don't work, try and flush the line. Nothing was working, so there's no option but to get the line out again. And obviously Layla was due scans at this point as well, and it was just shortly after that we found out she relapsed. And I did ask on numerous occasions a port inserted, which would be under the skin. So there was no chance of really them catching infection because it's within the body. But because Layla's chemotherapy and her treatments, they really needed the Hickman line. So there was 2 lines and they attached the extra line so she could have 3 or 4 things running in her at the one time, because mostly her treatment was needed. So we were denied a port. Like, we weren't allowed. We were told the port wouldn't be enough for Layla's treatment.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go on in a minute and just ask you about Layla's relapse, but just to complete what you've said on the infection and just to understand what you were told, are we right in understanding that you were told that it was an infection? Is that right?
Yes, we were told there was some form of infection within the line, which meant it had to be removed.
But you weren't told what it was or how it happened, is that right?
No,
Now,
we just said it was an infection.
as you say, Ms. Cunningham, there was, of course, 2 things happening now, and one of them was that, unfortunately, the scans showed that Layla had relapsed. Is that right?
That's correct.
And when you set this out at beginning at paragraph 64 for those who wish the references, but you were told that in fact the cancer had reached Layla's brain. Is that right? And
Yeah.
and there was a discussion about options. And are we right in understanding that you decided that the best thing was that Layla go on to palliative care at that point? Is that right?
No, that wasn't at that point. No, basically there was only one option of a drug called the Beacon trial, but there was only 2 rounds of that. So we did go ahead with 1 round of it, and basically it made Layla really unwell, and she was quite lifeless. She was been sick. Wasn't well with it at all. Was then spoke to her doctor about it, and he says, "Well, this is your option. You can either go ahead and try the second one, but Jan had showed now that it's kind of spreading through her spine and back through all her body. So basically, we said no. We're going to just leave it. But at this point, my doctor hadn't told me that that was basically it. That Layla was going to, that was her. And I remember walking out the corridor. We were sitting in Ward 2B, and I remember walking out the corridor, and one of the nurses came up to me and she gave me a cuddle and she was crying. She's like, "I'm so sorry." And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, and then I went in and I spoke to one of the outreach nurses in 2B and I said, "Listen, what's going on here?" But at this point, they'd moved me up to neurology because basically it was pain. And the sales consultant and one of the outreach nurses come up board, and basically the women, like, outreach nurse said, "You need to explain what's going on here." And basically he said that there wasn't any more options. Like, that was it. Like, so the nurses and things that knew that Layla didn't have any other options, that was going to be us at that point. When I was in neurological ward, they did say that they put a stent into Layla's head because the pressure was causing her the pain. She was on sorts of pain relief. She was on steroids to try and release the pressure. But basically the doctor says to me that in his personal and professional opinion, wouldn't want to put her in a stent because, 1, she would probably not make it off the table, and 2, it could have caused meningitis in the brain if they did do that. So at that point, we were discharged from basic neurology. There's nothing more they could do, and we were home. But at that point, we were just home, and then Layla, on the 1st of January, wasn't well, or she wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, her stomach was really swollen, and I'd basically phoned the hospital. We were taken in. They first thought that she needed a bit of like gut brace. They thought she had a gut infection, so they'd started to tube up her nose and into her stomach, and there wasn't a lot coming out into the bag. Whereas if there was an infection in her gut, this up into the bag, and basically it took them a day and a half to go, this isn't right, and we ended up going down for scan to be done of her stomach, and it turned out that the cancer had spread down her spine and took over her bladder, and her bladder had actually stopped at this point. And I was told she had to go to a theatre to get a catheter fitted. I mean, the catheter was fitted in theatre. They got like a litre and a half of fluid out of Layla's bladder. Like that's what had caused the swelling. Her belly was that like risen and that shiny, that there was that much fluid in her bladder that her bladder could have burst. So at that point, I was told that we'd have a catheter in now till the end, that was bladder had stopped working because of the cancer.
Now, you've told us in your statement that Layla passed away on the 13th of January, is that right?
Yeah.
And we can also see from your statement that you have some concerns about aspects of Layla's care in her final days.
Yep.
If you're able to, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Basically, we were admitted to the ward on the 1st, and on the 5th of January, my consultant wasn't on, so I seen a different consultant, worked alone with Layla, and basically I was taken into a room and basically said, listen, there's no more options, like, we're going to start palliative care, and at that point I had to sign a DNR order, because I knew Layla's cancer wasn't going to disappear. I knew that was it. But I did sign like the consent, and I said like I didn't want her resuscitated. I didn't want her to be ventilated if we were out and about. I wanted her to go back at home. Layla didn't want anywhere apart from like at home. So we had home at that point, but I did sign on it saying that if there was any sign of infection, Layla could have been treated with antibiotics. So on the 5th, we were basically, the nurses come in, they put pumps in her legs and stuff where they had their anti-sickness or pain relief, steroids, everything was getting put through these pumps into her body. Obviously at home I'd set up like our tubes, like she had her feeding tubes, I had that going, so fluids going in, and she was fine for like the first few days. We were discharged on the 5th, and she was fine. We were out and about. I took her to McDonald's. She was eating, she was drinking. And then on the 8th of January, I'd say to the outreach nurse that Layla, she was showing signs of her having the way she went when she had an infection within the ward. And basically, the outreach nurse says to me, well, we can't do bloods, which I knew we weren't allowed to do bloods, but obviously at that stage in time, we were discharged and told that Layla had weeks into months to go home and make memories. Like we had the conclusion that we'd weeks to months. That's what the doctor's opinion was. And on that, obviously, 8th of January, I says to the outreach team, like, Layla's going to sign off, go to bloods. And I says, no, I know that. But obviously, my head wasn't thinking properly, but a doctor and a nurse sat in the room with me to do our DNR order, and it states on it that antibiotics can be administered to Layla. She was to show signs of an infection, which she was, but they didn't offer it. And then Layla just kept deteriorating and been sick, and she was diarrhea. She wasn't well at all. And obviously, I'd phoned outreach nurse and said, "Listen, she's really unwell," and they said to me, "Oh, it's the pressure on her brain that's causing stress," and told me to give her midazolam, which I had in a lockbox in the house. First of all, they told me to give her a mil, like a 1 mil syringe. I did. It turned out it should have been a 0.1 mil that I was to give Layla. So basically that just Layla in, Layla asleep. But she was showing every sign of an infection. So the fact that we were discharged in months go away and make memories, and we only got 8 days at home was quite a shock. And the fact that they didn't give her antibiotics when it's our DNR order that they could have been administered. I knew they wouldn't take bloods, but they didn't even offer, knowing where my head would have been, the outreach team or the doctors didn't offer to give Layla the antibiotics that could have prevented her passing away as fast. Like, I'm not saying this infection wouldn't have, I knew Layla was going to pass away, but we were told that she had a longer. And the fact when I stated about the signs of the infection and it was just basically guarded, that's what hurts, because I feel as though that could have took time away, that we could have made memories.
Thank you. Ms Cunningham, I want to go now and have you maybe just describe your main concerns about Layla's care, and I'm going to take you through those in order. The first is the one I think you've just mentioned. As you've indicated, you had signed a form, a children and young persons acute deterioration management form. I think probably what we would all understand to be a DNR form. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, and as you've just said, that indicated on it the forms of intervention that you would agree to and that you wouldn't agree to if Layla deteriorated. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, and one of the ones that you said that you would agree to is that antibiotics could be considered to manage any fever. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
I think in your statement you indicate that the DNR form and some other information is not actually included within Layla's notes. Is that right?
Yep, basically when I spoke to my solicitor, like the date from the 1st of January to the 5th of January, we were in the ward and they were discharged. My solicitor had to ask me why she was in them because there wasn't any notes in her case notes, and there seems to be a lot of her notes, consultants and things that were missing. So I had to explain why we were in the hospital on the 1st and the 5th, and that was quite an important time because she went to surgery for the catheter. They were discharged from palliative care, but they knew she was in the hospital and she was discharged, but they didn't know why. I had to explain why that was.
Thank you. Now, a second issue that I think you have a concern about and that you've touched on today is about cleanliness on Ward 2A. More particularly, are we to understand that your concern is about the amount of cleaning that you saw going on?
Yeah, there was constant cleaning. Like, it started off, you would get your cleaner in the morning. Somebody would come in at night just to give it, change the bins, but at this point it got to the stage where there was cleaners coming in 2-3 times a day. The wards were constantly being cleaned. There was a substantial amount of cleaners being brought into the wards. Rooms being completely shut off with like tape. There was big like plastic coverings around the door, and basically sometimes you walk by and the blind was open and they had the vents pulled down, and it was a really strong smell. So it wasn't just normal cleaning materials that they would use. It was like an industrial cleaner. It was very, very strong smelling. You were walking up and down the ward, you couldn't miss the smell of it. And as I say, obviously you used to just get a cleaner in the morning, your bins changed at night, but they were coming in a few times a day, and it got to the stage like everything was getting cleaned. It wasn't just the floors, the toilets. They were cleaning all around the bed, pulling things out, cleaning absolutely everything in the room. And as I stated before, that's why everything had to be sent home, because we weren't allowed anything lying about anywhere in the toilet area, within the ward, like within your room area. The floor had to be cleared at all times.
Now, when you mentioned a moment ago there about industrial cleaning, you mentioned this in your statement. It's paragraph 78 for those who wish the reference, and you indicate that that was something you noticed in November or December 2017, and that takes me back to something I asked you about earlier. Are we right in understanding that, as far as you can recall, you actually saw an increase in the amount of cleaning over time?
Oh, yeah, right. Like the first month or two, we were absolutely fine. It was like the happiest place to be for your child. And then after a few months, like maybe 2.5 months, everything became very, very strict. Everything became, it wasn't like a children's ward. It was like being in somewhere, like as if the children had done something wrong. Like they weren't allowed to have their own things. Like it just wasn't a nice place to be. Like Layla was used to this nice, happy wee place, and then she didn't understand why her stuff was going away, why she wasn't allowed to do certain things that she had been doing, and to explain that to 2-year-olds can't explain it. You get a difference in them, and the happiness that they had for the first couple of months just disappeared. Like it wasn't a nice place to be for a child.
And just speaking about not being able to explain it, are we right in understanding, if we move on to a third concern that you've got, are we right in understanding that about 3 years later you watched a documentary on the BBC about the hospital, is that right?
Basically, I had never heard nothing at all. I was not knowing anything. I did know in December 2019 that stuff had come out about the water infection, but to me, I had passed away. I didn't give it a second thought. Some newspaper had contacted me to say, "Do I have anything to say on it? Did I want to speak about it?" And I'd said, "Well, no, because Layla, to me, I didn't know anything about it, so that wasn't a concern of mine." But obviously, on March 2020, I received a letter, 4th of March 2020, which I've sent to my solicitor, basically saying that from the Scottish Government that Layla's case is going to be reopened because they thought she was one of the kids affected with water infection, and that kind of took me back, because that's like 2.5 years after my daughter died, and it hit with that was it was really distressing. Basically, that was in March. We were then sent a big, huge booklet out to us in the April, which broke down things. But obviously, when you're not a professional nurse, doctor, or infection control, you don't know what to say. That there's 17% of this, you don't understand it. And then obviously there was a documentary aired just after it, and stated in it that it made you really upset and angry, because it stated that they knew about the infection before the hospital was open. It was addressed for 2 years without anybody doing anything about it. Basically, women that done the documentary, she went away abroad and had people that said they would have never opened the hospital. At that point, we found out that one of the antibiotics that our kids were on, which was making them unwell with really, really bad diarrhea and stuff, wasn't, we were told it was part of protocol, but it wasn't. That's when we found out antibiotic was particularly to treat bacterial infection that comes from water. Which made me question, like, is that why Layla had so many line infections? Because she was always in the bath. And, like, could it prevent her chemo from doing its full effect if the line was always infected? Also quite hard because we weren't aware of it. Like, if I knew there was anything going on like that when Layla passed away, I would have asked for a post-mortem to be done. But obviously we were were neglected of any information. And obviously for the 2.5 years I was out the ward, obviously other people knew what was going on as they were moved over to Ward 6A and Ward 4A. I wasn't within that ward, so basically I wasn't informed about nothing. Not one thing was I told about until the Scottish Government contacted me, and that's when I started doing investigations. And I'd contacted the ward to say I had this letter, could I get Jane Freeman's number to speak to her about it? And the nurses were like, oh, we never ever knew anything like that. And don't get me wrong, the nurses' care was fantastic. I can't fault them. Layla had a great bond with a few of them, but it's the way they made out as if they never knew, but they did, because they were the one that were administrating these antibiotics to our children. But the doctors and nurses and all the infection control, they knew. That's why that ward, it all made sense when this all came out, what started happening. But the thing is, because Layla died, it was as if they didn't need to inform me. And then obviously the Scottish Government came to me to tell me about it, and I was angry, I was upset, I was just like, you don't go over your daughter passing away, but if this infection was what was in her line towards the end and it took her sooner, if it's prevented her treatment from working properly, there's so many questions that I need answers to that we've been neglected a lot. If I knew there was anything going on, first thing I would have done when Layla passed away would be ask for a post-mortem. But I wasn't given that option because the hospital staff and the medical staff and the infection control, they didn't give us a chance to know anything was going on.
Thank you. So just to try and summarise some of that, Ms Cunningham, and I'm doing that because you did break up a little bit there. I think we've got 90% of what you said, perhaps more than that. I'm just going to ask you to summarise it, or summarise my understanding of what you've said. You got a contact in March 2020, I think, out of the blue, that Layla's case was being opened up. Is that right? And I'm going to ask you some more questions about that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there was some more correspondence, and then eventually you see the BBC programme, and I think a number of concerns for you emerged from that. One of them, I think, is that it was your understanding from that programme that the Health Board had known about an issue with the water supply for some time and had done nothing about it. Is that right?
Yeah, basically they knew about it before the hospital opened. Knew about it for a further 2 years, and there was a woman who came forward as a whistleblower and said, listen, I've been told about this over and over, and she was told, don't write anything down here, we just talk about it verbally. And eventually the woman went, no, this can't be right. And it was her that basically whistleblowed that made them look. So basically what was getting addressed about the water infection was getting put to the bottom of the pile 2 years once the hospital opened.
And the second thing was, of course, you understood that Layla had an infection while she was in the hospital. And that leads to the third thing. Did you start to wonder whether there might be a connection between the issue with the water and Layla's infection?
Basically, through Layla's 10 months of treatment, we never got a lot of time at home. So basically at home, Layla, if she was in a bath in the house, we had to wrap it up. She wasn't allowed to go swimming. She wasn't allowed in paddling pool. She wasn't allowed to do nothing. The only place Layla was really within the water was in the hospital. She would have a bath. The way she would have it at home, her bath and her jammies and stuff like that for bed. And it just made me wonder, she had 8 central lines in 10 months, which is a substantial amount of lines when usually a normal case you only go through 2 to 3 in a 3-year period of treatment. And obviously the fact that Layla had 8, it started to make me wonder, is this what all these infections had been? Had the infection in the line, was it in the main artery that prevented our chemotherapy from doing its full effect? Had that what helped? Is that what led to relapse? Because basically a transplant, all through Central Line as well. So questions started to pop up in my head of what's if and buts. I'm not saying for 1 second my daughter would not have passed away because her body was at the end was riddled with cancer, but I think that them not giving her the antibiotics when I asked, I think that prevented the time we had. And also, as I said, questions are in my head now of all these infections she had and having to go through surgery. It wasn't one surgery. She did a surgery to remove the line, and then 48 hours later, she did another surgery to reinsert it. She had scars in all different parts of her necks where lines had to be inserted. So, like, if this infection was going into the main artery of her body from these lines, what damage did that cause? And again, has that prevented Kayla's treatment from doing its full effect?
Thank you very much. That takes me really to the fourth concern that I understand you to emphasise in your statement, and that is about Layla's infections. And I'm going to ask you some questions about that. Before I do that, Ms Cunningham, we've been going now for about an hour and a half. I suspect it will take us about half an hour to complete your evidence. Would you like to keep going, or would you like a brief break?
Could I have a brief break, if
Of
possible?
course.
Certainly. Will we say 10 minutes?
Yep, that's fine.
Ms. Cunningham, I can see you. Can you see us?
Yep.
And clearly you can hear us. What I should have
Yep.
said at the beginning is that because of the camera position, it may seem that I'm looking over your shoulder. I mean, I don't know if you're seeing shots of me or not, but it may seem to you that I'm somehow distracted by looking left and right. The reason it looks that way is that I'm actually looking face on at the screen of which you appear, but it occurs to me that it might look a little bit impolite, as if I'm not paying attention. What I'm actually doing is trying to pay full attention. Now,
Yep.
Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, my lord. Ms. Cunningham, I was just going to move on really to ask you about one further matter, and as I indicated earlier, it's your concern around infection. And you've already told us quite a bit about that, and that Layla had a number of infections, as you understand it, and had to have her line changed on 8 occasions. Is that right?
Picture 8 lines all in.
8 lines all in. And I think you've indicated that you got this out of the blue communication that Layla's case was being looked into in March 2020. You've then got the BBC programme, and I think you indicated that you yourself started doing some further investigations.
Yeah, that's
You also, I think about a year after March 2020, so about a year after you were told that Layla's case is being looked into, you did actually receive the report from the case note review. Is that right?
yeah, that's correct.
And I think there's we understand there to be a large, detailed and complex general report and then an individual
Yeah.
report. Is that right?
Yep, that's
Yeah.
correct.
Now, I think it's obvious from everything you've said today about this, and also what you say in your statement, that you have quite a number of concerns about the whole way that that process was communicated. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. As to the actual conclusions of the case note review in Layla's case, I think you set them out at paragraph 92 of your statement. Is that right? Summarise them. You summarise
Yeah, I
them.
think so, yep.
Yeah. Maybe just turn that up, because I think we'll just walk through this.
92, sorry.
Paragraph 92. And I think if I was just to summarise what I understand them to have said, I think it's this, that Layla, as we know, she was discharged, I think, on about the 26th of October 2017, and she's a day case attender after that. Is that right? Yeah. And sorry, having asked you to look at paragraph 92, not everything that I'm saying is in that, so I apologise.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
We know that she came to hospital with a fever on the 22nd of November, that's right? Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. And one of the things I think they say is, and you've more or less indicated that today, her line was flushed and her condition deteriorated after that. Is that
Yeah,
right?
it was very rapidly, yeah.
And in fact, the way they describe it, I think, is that actually caused what they describe as a collapse. Is that right?
Yep.
And the crash team had to be there.
Had to be pulled up, yep. They couldn't get and talk it themselves within a couple of minutes. That they had to put out a call, and I was just told that the room was going to get really busy, just and not focus on what was going on in the room and just focus on Layla.
Yeah. And as far as an explanation for all of that, I think what they say is that there were cultures taken at the time, and these show infection from 2 types of bacteria. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And those were something called Enterobacter cloacae. Is that right?
That's right.
And another one, which I find quite difficult to pronounce, but I think it's Rauatella planticola or something like that. Is that right?
Which again, we were not. There was no indication of them telling us exactly what they were.
Yeah. Now, do you think that even in the report that you got in relation to Layla's case, do you think that the conclusions of the case note review people were clearly expressed?
Not so much, no, because basically it wasn't even put into. It was like, like wee bit at the bottom of a page and a wee bit on another page. Like they knew there was a lot more going on, and I was lucky if I got 1,000 words from them to indicate exactly what it was. There was hardly any information, any detail. It was just a case of, we're sorry, this is what we found. There was no intel to what the infections were. They didn't explain what they were, or she had 2 different infections in a line at the one time, or anything. Like there wasn't any detailed information. They just basically stated, this is what happened in this date, this is what happened when she was in the ward, and then the fact of what they found, and obviously it was distressing. The crash team was brought up, basically put what I knew. There was no explanation to me of anything extra. I only get told what I already knew. They didn't go into detail as much as should have when all the information came out. And like later on, that I realised, no, that's not even. Her life was worth more than 1,000 words.
I've got a couple of questions about that. Just when you say that you already knew, are you indicating to us that actually by the time you received Layla's report in April 2021, you already knew about the 2 bacteria?
I had heard about them, and like one of the notes we received. Obviously, I still to this day don't know exactly what infections are because I'm not specialised in that. But obviously, I've read that this is the sort of infections seem to be quite common with a few of the patients, that they seem to have the same sort of thing within lines. But obviously, there wasn't a lot of detailed information that
Yeah.
I could have got that I would have understood it.
Okay, but in terms of those 2 bacteria being involved
No, I wasn't
with
aware
Layla,
at that point in time what they were. No.
and I mean, how did you feel on seeing that?
Like, seemed like your daughter's life didn't really matter, that someone who can change out a paper with a certain amount of words in it is meant to make up for what you went through and what you've then continued to find out. It's like, I don't think a bit of paper is the right way to go about it. I know there was lockdown, but there could have been a face-to-face communication, i.e. video link, to go through this personally. But no, they just decided to give you a bit of paper and expect you just to sit and accept it and go, all right, this is what it was. I don't think they went the right way about it. And because I know a few of the parents were invited to meetings, but Layla was passed away, I had nothing, no, I seen from the ward page there was meetings and stuff, but never once did any of the parents who had this child get invited to any of these meetings to get any updates whatsoever.
So we're now at a stage more than 3 years after Layla has passed away, and you are reading for the first time that the line infection, or that an infection that she had in November of 2017 was connected to 2 bacteria which you'd never been told about before. Is that right?
Basically, we were never, even when she had any airline infections, we were never really told what they were. We were just told that the antibiotics didn't clear it and she was the new line. We were never, like, even when I got Layla's medical notes, but personally I couldn't do them. It would have been too hard, which I sent to my solicitor. So again, I don't know what infections Layla's had where we were even in the ward, if any of the 2 are the same ones she's had in the past. Like, I've not got a clue because I didn't go through anything. The only infection they stated was the one in November.
Thank you. Now, can I have you look at paragraph 92 if you've still got it in front of you?
Yep.
And it's just over the halfway point. You say the report conclude that they didn't really think. Got that?
Yep.
The report concludes that they didn't really think that the hospital had anything to do with it. Now, am I right in thinking that that's that those are your words rather than a
That was my
duct-taped
words,
quote?
yeah. From what I got in a explanation in a bit of paper, I think the NHS is trying to say they didn't have anything to do with it. That was my words, but really at the end of the day, I think there is more information there that wasn't detailed in like in the case note view that I received for an independent one because it was very plain, very blunt. There wasn't any other information. It was basically a few words and then sorry if this is missing. There wasn't enough information for me to say there's more to this because if they should have went into more detail, which they never.
I asked you a moment ago whether you thought, even in Layla's case, I asked you whether you thought that the case note review report was clearly expressed, and you indicated that it wasn't. Is that right? And I think you're indicating to us that the words that I've just read to you, those were your words, your understanding of what you thought the report was saying. Is that right?
Yep.
Am I right in saying that the report does say, in Layla's case, it does say at one point that there is a possibility that the infection was linked to the hospital environment?
Yep.
Thank you. Ms. Cunningham, I have come to the end of the questions that I have for you. Have you got anything further that you would like to add before we conclude?
Not that I can think of at the moment, no. I think everything that I've kind of had in my statement and wanted to put across has been addressed today.
Thank you very much. We have your concluding remarks in your statement, and we will certainly be looking at those. My Lord, I have no further questions for Ms. Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Thank you very much, Ms. Cunningham, and particularly having persisted with technical problems which have looked to being solved, because I found it very straightforward to follow your evidence. Thank you for providing your evidence directly today, but also, actually, what I'm going to try and do is address the camera and see if that actually makes me look as if I'm looking at you, because as I say, I want to underline that whereas the feed, the video feed may indicate that I'm looking away, I have been looking at your image on the screen. So thank you for your evidence today, but also thank you for providing the witness statement, which is again part of your evidence. So thank you very much, and that's the end of the evidence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, as I understand it, Mr. Duncan, that's not only the evidence for today, but for the evidence for this diet of hearings.
That's correct, my Lord.
Right. Thank you for your attendance, and I hope that you have had access to the practice direction or the direct procedural direction, I think, strictly speaking, number 4, which sets out my expectation of how we best use this evidence. As you'll have seen from the direction, a counsel to the inquiry will provide a written closing submission by the 3rd of December. Those court participants who wish to do so are not only free to make their closing submissions, but are very much encouraged to do so. You will see that the procedural direction itself is short, but in the attached note, I've tried to set out some of my thinking as to how we should go forward. I would strongly commend what appears in the second paragraph of the note. I am looking for your assistance, and I am expecting that you will wish to provide that. And as the next step in dealing with this body of evidence, I would encourage you to respond in the way as I have requested to Council's submission. I don't anticipate that you will feel confined by that. If Council has not represented the evidence in the way that you would analyse it, please provide your analysis. And if there are matters which should be looked at further, please highlight them. Because as you will see, what I envisage is that in relation to the matters which have been covered in the last, in 5 weeks of evidence, there will be more that the inquiry will wish to hear. And therefore, I would find it very helpful if you were to put forward anything additional to what is proposed by Council to the inquiry for the next stage. It's a question not just of a further hearing, but the investigative work which is necessary for any hearing. So I will be grateful for, but equally I look forward to and anticipate your assistance in doing this. And this is a general point. I think the way that we are trying to conduct this inquiry is in a collaborative way. If you have any contributions to make, and I'm sure you've picked up on this, we're very open to hearing from you informally by direct contact with the legal team, and I'm sure Council to the inquiry will welcome informal conversations or more or less more or less formal communications. We really want to engage with you because I don't think the inquiry will achieve its purpose of fulfilling the terms of reference if we don't get the assistance of the court participants. Well, with that, thank you very much again for your attendance. It may be some time before we meet in this particular context, but as I said, inquiry will always be very open to being in touch with proposals, comments, and suggestions. Thank you.